Hi everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of live webinars delivered by the Cancer Psychology team at North Bristol NHS Trust. Today we're going to be exploring issues around emotional health in the climate of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're going to be talking about cancer-specific challenges, and we'll also be discussing some practical tips and skills for looking after yourself during this challenging and difficult time. Just to note that this webinar is being recorded, so for all of those of you that are in the live audience today, your microphones will be muted for the duration of the talk, and then we'll stop the recording at the end and be able to take some questions from the chat and from anybody directly. And similarly, if you did wish to revisit anything that we'll be covering today, the recorded version will be available online, as I said, and we'll send an email around notifying you where it's going to be and details of how to access this. So, as I mentioned, we're from the Cancer Psychology team. My name is James Warren. I'm an assistant psychologist working within the service. And my work primarily involves supporting individuals post-treatment for cancer. And I also run a group called the Living Well course, which some of you watching may have attended. And over the past year, and in response to COVID, we've adapted to some of the barriers presented by the pandemic by shifting much of our work to remote delivery over Zoom. And although we recognise that it's not the same as holding a talk or a meeting or a group in person, we do hope that you can feel that you'll take something away, take something positive away from today's session.
And hello everybody, I'm Veronica and I'm one of the clinical psychologists in the team and she'll be joining James today with the presentation. So who is this presentation for? Well, we've set this webinar up for anyone who is receiving healthcare from North Bristol NHS Trust for a diagnosis of cancer. So if you are someone who's been affected by cancer, but receive healthcare from outside of this trust, of course you are welcome to join us for this webinar today. But if you do feel you could benefit from further support or have any personal queries following this presentation, we would suggest that you do contact your own healthcare team. And these are our aims for today's webinar. We shall be sharing with you an understanding of how the pandemic has affected many of us in terms of our psychological well-being. We shall then be looking more specifically at what we understood it means to be dealing with a cancer diagnosis and the challenges of treatment alongside COVID. Next, we plan to offer you some guidance on how you can attend to your own well-being by providing you with some practical skills, as well as some information on various avenues for support. At the end of this section, we shall stop the video recording of the webinar. And we invite those of you who are joining us live today to stay with us for a question and answer session. And we'd be happy to answer any specific questions that you'd like to put to us at that point.
So the word unprecedented really has seen unprecedented use this year, and it's true to say that 2020 stands out as one of the most unique and challenging periods in recent history. And throughout the world, we've watched as the pandemic has spread to almost every continent, country and culture across the globe. And we've experienced firsthand the impact of this, the devastating loss of life, and the various lockdown measures that were put in place and the impact that this has had on psychological well-being. This felt sense of fear, loneliness, uncertainty that almost everyone can identify with in some way or another over the past year. So we were interested to know if this was reflected in the research too. Before COVID, according to one large meta-analysis, which is a study which reviews the results of many studies, and in this case took into account research across multiple countries and cultures, just over 1 in 10 of the population met what the researchers would describe as a clinically significant level of anxiety. So a threshold where their feelings of anxiety are affecting their ability to function and impacting their life in a significant way. And when we compare this to another more recent meta-analysis that's looked to explore the prevalence of anxiety since COVID-19, in order to see how the pandemic has affected mental health broadly, similarly, This study examined lots of other studies across multiple countries, and what they found is that this figure of 1 in 10 since the pandemic had increased to around 3 in 10, which is of course a very significant increase in the level of anxiety and the number of individuals that are feeling this way. And for many people, it might be unhelpful to use labels such as anxiety and depression as symptoms in describing mental well-being, but here, I suppose it could be useful just as a way of understanding the literature around one aspect of emotional health across a population. And this story is much the same when we look at rates of depression globally. So before COVID, just under 1 in 10 individuals met this threshold for clinically significant depression, whereas since the pandemic, the number of individuals feeling this way was just over 3 in 10. So again, a very large increase here. So what we can see is that over this year, the research too suggests that the pandemic has had a measurable impact on individuals' emotional and psychological well-being. And of course, our emotional well-being isn't just limited to how anxious or depressed we feel. It is, of course, so much broader than this, and this is something we'll be discussing in greater depth today. So what are some of these challenges of the pandemic that have affected our mental health and well-being? Well, the mental health charity Mind spent some time investigating this and surveyed more than 14,000 adults over the past year to find out what the most common challenges affecting our psychological well-being during the pandemic have been. And ranked at number 1, perhaps unsurprisingly, by 79% of respondents, was being unable to see friends, family, and partners that they didn't live with. The next was feeling anxious about family or friends getting coronavirus. Not being able to go outside except for essential reasons. Feeling bored and or restless. And feeling anxious about getting coronavirus. So it seems true then that some of these challenges have been felt by almost everyone, and that many individuals sharing concerns over many of the same issues here, as we can see. But what's not true is that everyone is in the same boat. So we of course know that for some, this past year has been a much greater challenge than for others. And rather than saying we're all in the same boat, it can be more helpful to think of the metaphor here of being in the same storm, but on different boats. So there are many of us that might be on small boats, some maybe with just one oar, really feeling the impact of the storm, the turbulence of the waters and currents, with little control over where we're being pushed or pulled. And others might feel a little bit more comfortable and feel impacted but less intensely affected, with a greater sense of control over perhaps their jobs or health. Whilst a select few we know might be sitting comfortably on board a super yacht, scarcely affected by the storm at all. So we might all be in the same storm, but it's really important to acknowledge that the situations we find ourselves in will vary considerably.
As a team of psychologists at Southmead, our goal is to support people faced with cancer. And what we really want to understand is the ways in which all of the issues discussed so far have impacted on people dealing with this diagnosis and the various treatments that follow during the last year. And as such, what we want to share with you now are the findings of a research study which is being carried out by Macmillan at the University of Southampton, as they have managed to capture just some of the aspects of what the last year has been like for some people living with cancer. They interviewed a number of people during lockdown, and this is what was shared. Some people identified feeling more stressed and anxious in relation to uncertainty that's come about with the coronavirus. Others mentioned feeling as if they had lost a sense of purpose by not being able to engage in social activities. Some people said they felt well supported, but were concerned about the impact of treatment longer term. Others were concerned about the risk of contracting the virus from others, such as those they lived with or cared for them. And despite the difficulties, some people also talked about finding a new way to adjust to a new normal. And we wonder, as you look at this, how many of you relate to any of these responses, or whether your experience throughout the last year has been different. And I'd just like you to have a moment to reflect upon that. Of course, with the help of technology, we, the cancer psychology team at Southmead Hospital, have been fortunate enough to have been able to have carried on supporting people throughout the last year. And here are just some of the things that we've heard in this time about what has felt particularly stressful for some people about living with cancer at the moment. So somebody shared this: because nobody is able to come into the hospital with me, they have no idea what chemo is like. Somebody else shared, I'm trying to homeschool on top of everything else. Another person said, I just want to be able to hug my friends. Another quote here, I'm worried my surgery will be delayed. And somebody said, I can't get to the gym, which I know would help. So what's clear from the research that's in the process of being gathered and from what we're hearing directly from people is that this last year for many has been a particularly challenging time. Uncertainty has been worrying, and people have felt less able to do the things that they feel would have helped them cope. So perhaps there's no surprise there. But the good news is that there are ways in which we can look after ourselves. So what are they? Well, a good place to start is to begin by recognizing not just what we can't do, but what we can do. And this idea is reflected in this more commonly used serenity prayer, which reads, to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So if you wanted to deal with stress and the amount of stress that you're facing, how would you do that? Well, one way to imagine how we deal with stress is to imagine that we all carry around with us a stress bucket. And this stress bucket represents our capacity to cope. The liquid that pours into our stress bucket represents the stress that we're enduring. So many of the stresses that fill our buckets are ones which feel out of our control. And of course, when these build up, our stress bucket becomes very full as we feel unable to cope, the level reaching closer to the top. And often individuals share with us that during these times, smaller things that may not have been such a problem before, when adding to this already full bucket, can cause it to overflow. Perhaps many of you can relate to this feeling, a sign perhaps that you are just carrying a much fuller bucket than usual, and this overspill is understandable given the circumstances. What we know can help, though, is learning ways to create drain holes in our buckets. These holes are things that we can do to help ourselves to reduce the level of stress that we're carrying. And so, at a time when much still is and feels out of our control, what may be important to remember is what we can do to look after ourselves in the best possible way.
So in addition to this, it can be helpful to hold in mind elements of the approach we use within our team, ACT, which stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. So in a nutshell, ACT is an approach is all about untangling from unhelpful thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and importantly, taking active steps towards living a life according to one's chosen values. So it recognizes that distressing thoughts and feelings are often an understandable response to a distressing situation. And rather than getting hooked by these thoughts and feelings and reacting and behaving in unhelpful ways, it encourages individuals to find more helpful ways to respond and invites people to explore ways of acting guided by their values. And what we mean by values is really what matters to you. So what feels deeply important to you on a personal level, what drives you in being the type of person that you want to be.
And one way of putting ACT into practice is to follow 6 steps, which I shall explain to you in turn now. So firstly, begin by becoming aware. Adopt the stance of a scientist. Be curious to observe what's going on in your inner world. And by this we mean what thoughts, feelings, memories, urges, or sensations are you experiencing right now? And once you've become aware, invite yourself to acknowledge what's coming up and name it. For example, here's worry. The next stage is about connecting with your physical body. Having acknowledged where your mind is at, can you bring your attention to what you've got control of right now, coming into your body? And you can do this by slowly pushing your feet into the floor and focus on how it feels on the soles of your feet. If you're sitting, perhaps just take a moment to sit upright, to stretch, and just notice how that feels. Breathing is another great way to bring your attention back to your body. We all, of course, breathe all of the time, and yet we rarely pay attention to how it feels in our body to breathe. So just take a moment to notice your breathing, perhaps to focus on one bigger breath in through your nose and see how that feels in your chest and in your tummy. And then when you breathe out, see if you can release any tensions that you might be holding in your body. And now, having taken the time to acknowledge what's going on for you in the moment and coming back into your body, we'd invite you to practice self-compassion. And by this we mean, see if you can say or do something kind for yourself. We're not always good at being kind to ourselves. So if this feels difficult, consider this. If this was a friend experiencing this feeling, having these thoughts, what would you say to them? And finally, recognize that you have a choice now as to how you are going to respond in this moment. What's important to you right now? And how can you ensure that what you do next is in line with what really matters to you as a person? So this is the AABB cycle, which is something that can be practiced in a few minutes. And I appreciate that for many of you, this may be the first time you've heard of anything like this. But what we know from our experience as clinicians and from the research is that if you're able to run through this regularly every day, you can start to find helpful ways to respond to distressing thoughts or feelings, which really are inevitable during challenging times.
So we've spoken about recognizing what is within and outside of our control and focusing our efforts on what we can do something about. So we'd really just invite you now to think about some of the following well-being tips that will appear on screen and just gently hold in mind how many of these you think you're doing at the moment and which of these connect with your own values and what feels important to you. And while some of these might sound a bit obvious, we know that when we are struggling, these are the things that can be easily overlooked and forgotten and yet can really help to ground us and provide a sense of well-being. So reliable sources of information. Well, really here, we're just inviting the question of where are you getting your news from? Is it from a reliable source, or have you been finding yourself reading information that's originated or been shared from social media? We know that more radical viewpoints tend to receive higher traction on social media and other platforms, and sometimes more balanced perspectives can receive less attention. So just reminding ourselves of this.
So maintaining or establishing a routine. Setting a plan for the day or week ahead can really help to give you a sense of purpose and fulfillment. And if you're going to do this, you may want to consider making sure that it's balanced. So it's not just about tasks that you need to get done, but also making time to focus on looking after yourself and doing the things that you enjoy.
So keeping socially connected to others. Well, whilst we can't meet physically, we know that keeping socially connected can provide an important sense of feeling in touch with others. And technology allows for ever more connectivity now, where we can see and speak to others despite restrictions.
Going for a walk in nature, well, getting outside, as many of us know instinctively, can provide a sense of being connected to the outside world. And of course, this becomes that bit more appealing now that the weather is improving. But there is also a lot of research which shows that there really is a benefit for being in green space, and there can be a real positive impact on our psychological well-being if we do so.
So not trying to take on too much, and especially during lockdown when we feel we have more time than usual, this can be tempting, but we need to be kind to ourselves and not take on too much. Being really realistic about what is achievable and not beating ourselves up if we don't manage to achieve as much as we might have planned.
Keeping physically active. So we know that keeping physically active is important, irrespective of the pandemic, but now more than ever, it's important to exercise as it can offer a real boost to our mood and well-being, as well as keeping us healthy. We can also be creative with how we keep active. So if you've tried something but it didn't suit you, you can always try something else. There are many ways to keep active, so it might just be worth experimenting with something new to suit your preference and your ability.
So limiting news consumption. Well, despite the bonuses of technology that I just mentioned in keeping us connected, there can be some downsides. So now at any given time of day, we can tune into the latest news. And at times like this, where the focus is on COVID across the globe, this does have the potential to be overwhelming and consume our attention. So whilst it is important to stay updated, limiting news consumption to certain times of day or setting times can be helpful in ensuring that we are within healthy limits, and this can help to foster a greater sense of well-being.
Set aside time to relax. So for many of us, as always, it's tempting to turn on the TV or turn to our phones when we feel we want to switch off. But of course, this does keep the brain still going. And of course, that's fine if that's what you're after. But to find other ways to relax, you might want to engage with other activities like listening to music, having a bath, or trying some relaxation or mindfulness exercises, which can really help.
So eating and drinking well, this is of course another important factor irrespective of the pandemic, but it can be easily forgotten or overlooked during times of stress. So here routine can really help in making good food decisions, like cooking a healthy meal, a bit easier than defaulting to takeaway when there's no food in the house, for example. And whilst having a drink in lockdown isn't going to cause any harm in moderation, using alcohol as a way of passing time and as a coping strategy can have harmful consequences.
Sleeping well. Having a good night's sleep can really help with your mood and your well-being. And for some people going through treatment, of course, sleep can become disturbed or irregular, but there are still ways to practice good sleep hygiene, such as avoiding naps in the day and steering clear of stimulants like caffeine just before bed. So if you are having problems with your sleep, it's worth considering what you can do to best set yourself up for a better night's sleep.
So getting creative. Well, the lockdowns have meant that for many of us, our usual coping strategies can be just out of reach. So many hobbies and interests that we might have enjoyed may not be possible to engage with at the moment. So we'd really invite you to get creative. So thinking of novel ways to tap into elements of these hobbies or interests. This could include starting an art project, for example, as a means of engaging creativity, or devising a new exercise routine, like Veronica mentioned, to mix things up, or even setting up a virtual pub quiz with friends just as a way of connecting. So really, we'd invite you to think about and explore whatever best speaks to you.
And finally, finding simple pleasures. Sometimes it really is the simple things in life that can make all the difference. So it's worth recognizing what these are for you, whether it's reading a good book, listening to music, watching a new TV series, or even talking with a good friend whilst having a cup of tea. Now, as James said before, we realize that many of these tips are based on ideas about well-being that are not rocket science, and you probably know about them yourselves. But we'd like to give you the opportunity just to pause and ask yourself, are you doing enough to ensure you are looking after yourself at the moment? Do any of the tips that we've just mentioned stand out as being perhaps ones you'd like to address? Ones you think that if you focused on and practiced would make a difference to your day? And if so, how might you like to start putting this into practice from now?
So having explored some of these wellbeing tips, we'd invite you to think about the values that you might like to guide you, much like a compass through the storm during this challenging time. To give an example, a chosen value might be around connection and friendship. So recognizing that during the pandemic, it can be easy to go days and weeks without speaking to friends or family, even if we are very close. And an action in line with that might be to ensure that we make time to send a message or schedule a phone or video call, or even to send them a letter to let them know you've been thinking about them. So what we want to allow here is just some space for you to reflect on this question. So if you could look back in a few months' time at how you navigated this situation, how might you like to respond in a way that embodies your own personal values? What actions might you like to have taken in line with these?
So this continues to be a time when we may feel less well connected than before due to the physical restrictions, of course, that the pandemic has brought about. But please do know that your healthcare team at Southmead are very much here and would like you to contact them if you wish to ask any questions about your health or your treatment, or if you wanted to raise any concerns. And we're here to help support you too. So if you feel you could benefit from further psychological support, please do let your nurse specialist or your cancer support worker or any of your healthcare team know, and they can refer you to our service if need be. So we offer both one-to-one support, and also, as James mentioned right at the beginning, we run a number of Living Well courses for people who've come to the end of treatment.
So as Veronica's just said, if you do have any concerns, then please do raise these with your healthcare team. And if you feel that you're in need of further support, there are some other organisations that we would recommend that offer guidance and support, such as those on screen now. So yeah, that brings us to the end of the webinar today. And yeah, we hope you found it useful, and many thanks for joining us or watching the recording from wherever you are.